All right, so welcome to lecture 3 on international law. We are going to try and briefly explain the laws of war and how the laws of war have been affected by recent wars. So this is going to be just a brief explanation of the topic. We are not going to go in depth, but if you're interested to know more about it, there is plenty of information online, including scientific articles and books. So we spoke in the past two lessons. We spoke about the we made an outline of the international system. We also spoke about um, um, any kind of developments in international system that led to international law to be transformed in a supranational law or to contribute to the global governance. And today we are going to speak about the laws of war and how they've been affected by recent wars. You can find more information in Globalization of World Politics, Chapter 19. You can also find more information in Joshua Goldstein and Pevenhouse International Relations, Chapter 7. And you can definitely find more information in this particular sources. So let's proceed. We are going to go through a general overview. So the law of war or the humanitarian law represents a component that regulates the conditions of war, and it's part of the international law. Okay. Now, the laws of war are going to define the concept of sovereignty. Are going to be linked to the concept of nationhood. Are going to be related a lot to states and territories, to occupation, and so on and so forth. The modern laws of war will also address problems of declaration of war, acceptance to surrender, treatment of prisoners of the war, military necessity along with distinction and proportionality, prohibition of certain weapons, treatment after the end of the war. Now, basically the humanitarian law nowadays is going to address not only what happens during the war or why the war started. It regulates, it has specific regulation on how to wage the war, how to behave during the war, and how to behave after the war ended already. Now, one important thing you have to remember is that laws of war are different from other bodies of law, such as, for example, domestic law or internal law. This is why it is very difficult to apply them to certain situations that occur on the domestic level. Now, of course, we cannot mention the laws of war, and we cannot speak about war if we don't refer to international relations theories, right? We spoke a lot about realism during the past semester, and we said that according to realism, the human nature is selfish, and therefore the state is going to only care about their national interest. So in relation to war, realism states that relations between states aren't governed by justice. Okay, so the question of just war actually doesn't have a point. So there is no just war. It's the states will simply not be motivated by justice, but they're going to be only motivated by national interest. So in this case, the reason excuses any kind of means used in a war, and the foreign policy should not be governed by morality or justice, but only by national interest. Now, on the contrary, the pacifism, and we spoke about peace studies, states that the war is always unjust, and therefore it's always wrong. Now, is it a valid statement? Well, it's the strength part is that in principle, yes, the wars are always unjust, but in fact, it's kind of a weak statement because sometimes the only way to sort out certain issue is to wage a war. Okay. Another statement or another idea launched by the pacifists is that aggression by a state does not need to be resisted by war, as there are other means to sort out a problem. Okay, so actually these methods may only work if aggression is responsive to justice, right? So basically, if people fear to start a civil war, or people are actually following the legal thing. Okay, so war always involves a violation of moral duties, right? So basically, whatever is related to war cannot be linked to moral. Okay, now in order to explain the laws of war, we have to discuss about the just war theory. Okay, so the just war theory is the basis on which nations will seek legally and morally to justify a war they ever waged. And the just war theory attempts to include together, to put together three major things or major concepts. Taking human life is seriously wrong. States have a duty to defend their citizens and defend justice. Protecting innocent human life and defending important moral values sometimes requires willingness to use force and violence. So basically, what are the main elements of just war concept? Jus ad bellum is going to relate to the conditions under which the use of military force is actually justified, or easier to say is why a certain state starts a war. Okay, jus ad bellum is going to involve the conditions or the relations under which, or let's say, how do you have to conduct the war? How would it be ethical to behave during the war, in order so like not to create more damages than normally, right? And jus post bellum is going to concern with the most just ways of ending the war, or let's say, what are we going to do with the combatants? How are we going to treat those who lost the war? How are we going to treat those who suffered from war, and so on? So we're going to go through these elements one by one, and we are going to see the main components. This element for this three elements, I have selected 6 main characteristics, and we are going to go through them one by one. Now, jus ad bellum, or going to war. Okay, from the various war theories, it is possible to identify actually that the following characteristics when just to start the war. Number 1. A just case. There should be a reason for going to war. Okay, and this reason should be just and cannot be only recapturing, let's say, taking over to new territories or punishing people who have done wrong to you. Number 2, a competent authority. The war can only be declared by legitimate authority, for example, an elected government. So basically, the just war, jus ad bellum, actually means that the war can only be declared by a state and not by a non-state actor. Jus ad bellum also includes the idea of right intention. So the intention as well as the cause must be just. You don't have to just declare that you start a war in order because you are aggressed, but you don't have to, as a states don't have to have there should be no hidden reason to start a war. For example, a territorial interest or intimidation. Okay, so sometimes in past, seeking for glory was often promoted as an intention for going to war. So these are the first 3 characteristics related to jus ad bellum. The next 3 characteristics are strong likelihood of success. So there should be some chance of success. Otherwise, the war would be a pointless loss of life. So how this success actually can be judged? I mean, even for the parties that lost the war, how are we going to justify the success? For example, at the beginning of 20th century, or the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, the Zulus were slaughtered by the British, but success for them partly meant maintaining their warrior pride despite the losses, because there were lots of losses from the British side, and in order just to demonstrate that actually the British army is a strong army, they started to slaughter the Zulus. Now, proportionality. We are going to actually notice that the principle or the characteristic of proportionality is included in most of the, for all the three elements, jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. So, from the perspective of jus ad bellum, proportionality means that the harm which the war causes must be proportional to proportionally less than the harm which the war aims to overcome. So basically, if a certain state was attacked by any means, and if the states decide to go for war, the losses, okay, and the harm which the war is going to cause should be less than what happened to the state that was attacked. And the last resort, the just war has to be a last resort. Like, you don't have to just start a war because because a state doesn't have to start a war because they got pissed off by other states not following their national interest, or there should be diplomatic ways used to try and sort out a conflict before the decision of violence is made. So this can include negotiation, this could include economic and cultural sanctions, and so on. Okay, so jus ad bellum, this would be the characteristics for jus ad bellum. Jus in bello, or the behavior of the states or the belligerent parties once the war begins. Again, we're going to speak about 6 characteristics. Proportionality. The means used to fight the war needs to be proportional to the nature of the dispute. So basically, it is unjust to use a nuclear weapon in a war over a fishing territory. Like, there is no point to do that. Okay? Discriminate appropriate targets. For world war to be just war, there must be a discrimination between combatant and civilians. What does it mean? It means that the belligerent parties are not going to harm the civilians, and they're going to try and protect them, or at least remove them from the zones that are under the attack. Obey international law. So there are a number of conventions that were signed over the history, and they basically were signed by many countries, and they should be taken into consideration before, or let's say, before the war begins, as well as during the time the war is waged. Okay. So, in recent years, the use of gas and chemical weapons, for example, and the treatment of prisoners of war have come under the control of conventions which combatants should obey. So basically, according to the Geneva Convention, the belligerent parties are actually not allowed to use chemical weapons. Okay. Now, fair treatment of the prisoners. The Geneva Convention says that the surrendering or captured prisoners should not be mistreated. So, belligerent parties are not actually allowed to mistreat the prisoners, and they should be kept in fair isolation, away from the battle areas, and exchanged for own prisoners of war once the war has ended, okay, or during the war. So today there is a question whether terrorists, for example, deserve such a treatment, because technically they're a non-state actor, and it's a huge question whether the terrorist attacks or the terrorist groups are actually following the laws of war. No means rea, or no means malum, or let's say the belligerents should not use any weapons or any actions that would be of bad interest or bad intent. Okay, so basically, mass rape is not an ethic way to behave during a war. Forcing enemy to fight against their own side, robbery is not actually allowed by the laws of war. No reprisal of any kind. So basically, if a country A commits an atrocity against country B, and by accident or design, bomb the children's home or a school, the country B should not actually respond in the same way. So the country B should behave ethical, and should find another ways to basically punish in this case. Jus post bellum, or after the war. I have also selected 6 characteristics, and in this case, again, we're talking about proportionality. So in this case, the treatment of defeated states should be reasonable, right? So basically, there will be no revenge by those states that were affected by the state which started the war in future. And there should be imposed certain ways to allow the state to actually exist in future and reinforce itself. Okay, discriminate appropriate targets. Okay, so basically, while dealing with a defeated nation, the victorious side should make a distinction between enemy leaders, soldiers, and civilians, right? So basically, while taking a decision of how to punish the defeated nation, the victorious nations should actually take into consideration first and foremost the punishment of the leaders, rather than they're going to punish the entire the civilians and the soldiers, because those two categories, like the soldiers, only follow the leaders. What the leaders are telling them to do, or the leaders' orders, and the civilians are actually those categories that are affected first and foremost by the war. Okay, so basically the victorious countries most likely are going to use sanctions on the defeated nation, rather than they are going to use some physical abuse, for example. And the third characteristic of jus post bellum will include the idea that all the issues which caused the war should be sorted out. Okay, so this in future would help to ensure that the damages caused by a war will be outweighed by the good which the war hoped to achieve. So basically, when we spoke about United Nations, we mentioned the peace building concept, right? So the Geneva Conventions again unconditionally supports that that anything that could cause a new war and a new conflict between the belligerent parties is going to be let's say is going to be tackled and removed. So basically, another characteristic of the jus post bellum is the punishment of the war criminals. So the war criminals should be prosecuted, and the victims of the war given justice if their rights were violated. And in our next lesson, we are going to speak about the International Criminal Court and about all the other efforts that were done to punish the war criminals in the past. For now, you have to just remember this as a characteristic of jus post bellum. The fifth characteristic of jus post bellum, or feature of jus post bellum, is compensation to aid recovery. So basically, there should be financial measures taken to assist the recovery of the countries which had fought in a war or had any damages. So, for example, after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan was one of the tools which helped Germany and other countries to recover, and other European countries to recover after the war. And the last characteristic of the jus post bellum is rehabilitation for the defeated. So anyone who, or let's say the countries that suffered from from war should have rehabilitating measures in order to rebuild the infrastructure, to rebuild the social structure of governments, to work on the development of the policies and education, healthcare, and so on. Okay. Now, I will ask you to reflect on the following questions and try and answer them on your worksheets. It's very important to take into consideration the contemporary legal framework that is regulating the wars. So we have to take into consideration two main institutions, law institutions, the Hague Conventions, signed in 1899 and 1907, which basically take into consideration the war crimes and how exactly the state should behave after the war has ended, and as well as the behavior during the war. And then we have the Geneva Conventions signed in 1949, which are mostly related to the behavior, the jus ad bellum, okay, and jus in bello. So basically, Geneva Convention works with such issues like amelioration of condition of the wounded, sick, and armed forces in the field, condition of the wounded and shipwrecked members of armed forces at the sea, treatment of the prisoners of war, and protection of civilian person in the time of war. Another legal institution that was, or let's say, involves certain articles related to the laws of war or regulating the war is the Charter of United Nations, which basically is basically related, or let's say has points including the use of force in or allows using the force in two situations. The use of force in the self-defense, which basically remained an unqualified sovereign right, and the use of force as part of peace enforcement action sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council, and this is part of the peacekeeping concept. Okay. So basically, all these changes led to the change of the concept of jus in bello, and the trend actually in this particular case was less one of the radical change in its core principles or those characteristics we discussed a little bit earlier, and it actually included more of a gradual expansion of the scope of international legal constraints which are allowed during the war. So, if we are considering the changes that happened, which happened in the just war theory, we could say that since 2001, both jus ad bellum and jus in bello have actually came under a challenge. Basically, because and that is visible in the behavior of the U.S. administration, which pushed the limits of the international law and in their behavior of war when they started the wars against the insurgencies, and it was also conditioned by the behavior of Russia, who undermined the territorial integrity of certain countries or certain neighboring countries, or those countries that were in post-Soviet space, and mainly Ukraine. So basically, in this case, for example, Bush administration's invasion to Afghanistan was mostly seen as a legitimate act of self-defense. In this case, the Taliban government actually have openly harbored the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization responsible for 9/11 attacks in New York. And however, the invasion in Iraq in 2003 actually was criticized a lot as a violation of the international law. Several successive administrations attempted to establish a new right of preventive self-defense, and however this actually failed, and because US was not really able to persuade the majority of Security Council, and we discussed this as part of the role of United Nations when basically certain European countries like France and UK actually did not really support the US in their position regarding the attacking Iraq in 2003. Okay, so basically the behavior of US in 2003 was not sufficient to justify I would say the extent of illegal actions of Saddam Hussein, and that basically was perceived as an abuse of jus in bello as part of the war on terror doctrine. In the same, it is very important to also point out here that the treatment of the suspected terrorist combatants was also against the jus in bello principles, and the way the American American army actually treated the war prisoners was highly criticized, especially in the retention camp in Guantanamo Bay, were actually against the 1949 Geneva Convention. In the last decade, the fears of the fears of the revisionist practices and unilateral approach of U.S. actually created lots of questions from its partners, right? So in this case, and also the actions that were taken by U.S. In 2001 and later on in 2003 against Afghanistan and Iraq, and their further implications in different conflicts actually raised lots of questions related to how legitimate their interventions are. And this is why later on Barack Obama actually have tried to align the actions of U.S. to the establishment of the international law. And in this case, he closed the Guantanamo detention center, and he banned the rendition for purposes of torture. He allowed them. He gave a mandate to Red Cross to access anyone that was detained in the conflict, and he tried to re-engage in a multilateral process on the use of force. So basically, he persuaded a multinational coalition to participate in the wars, in the similar wars in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world. So this is it about the laws of war. I would like to ask you to read a case study on page 214, 217 and analyze how the Western US war tradition differs, for example, from an Islamic US war tradition. And you have to mark your answers in the worksheet provided. Any other questions you might have, you can address them to me.